piercing through the darkness with the radiant light of truth. This is the Alchemical Lantern. Good evening, everyone. This is your host, Wayne McCroy. We are broadcasting live tonight on Rockfin and on Free World FM. Welcome aboard. Tonight we're going to discuss Darwinian Evolution and Marxism. We'll be reading tonight primarily from a book titled Marx And Satan, written by one Mr. Richard Wurmbrand. This is an interesting read, folks. Tells you a little bit of something about who Karl Marx was and about where he espoused his philosophy from. And we'll see that one of the biggest contributions to cultural Marxism was the rise of the theory of Darwinian evolution. And we'll see, as we read through this tonight, how Marx was influenced by Darwinian thought, and how these men seemed to feed off of one another in certain ways with their ideologies. And we'll come to the conclusion, well, I think it's a logical conclusion we could come to, that these two different philosophies are intermingled and intermarried in a lot of ways, Darwinian evolution and cultural Marxism. They do relate. It is about social engineering agendas. It's about steering the behaviors of mankind in certain directions based upon what they would call the science. And Darwinian evolution has never truly been proven out. It's a theory, and you'll get those people today that will argue that it's pretty sound and that there's a lot of evidence for it. But I think that evidence doesn't pass the test of scrutiny when it comes down to brass tacks with everything. Simply because there's never been demonstrated any kind of transitional species, as it were, as Darwin predicted there would be innumerable numbers of these different transitional species that would be recorded in the fossil record and various other places here, and we would see them in the span of humanity's existence here, and we've never experienced anything where we've seen a transitional species. Now, we do see various types of adaptations that take place within the animal kingdom and the mineral kingdom and the vegetable kingdom, as it were, if you want to look at all of that from a more esoteric perspective, but we don't truly see speciation happen, and they will argue, of course, that they do see speciation, that they've observed this when, in fact, it hasn't really been any type of a major change, more of an adaptation, and it's all a simple playing around with the definitions of terms and words like that. But let's get right into the reading here, and we'll see what this whole idea of Darwinian evolution has to do with Marxism, with cultural Marxism, and we'll go from there. So, Marx, Darwin, and Revolution. Marx and Darwin. What was the specific contribution of Marx to Satan's plan for mankind? The Bible teaches that God created man in his own image in the book of Genesis 1:26. Up to the time of Marx, man continued to be considered as the crown of creation. Marx was Satan's chosen tool to make man lose his self-esteem, his conviction that he comes from high places and is meant to return to them. Marxism is the first systematic and detailed philosophy which drastically reduces the notion of man. And I'm going to pause for a second there. I think that that's a sound argument on many levels, although I think it's been going on since before Marx came around. And honestly, I don't know if Marx was the one who really espoused all these ideas on his own. That being said, understand that the idea of this revolutionary process that Marx was looking for and how the Darwinian evolution theory ties to it were used in order to make man feel insignificant and to push other agendas and explanations for the creation. So, with that being the case, it has driven man more towards a secular humanist viewpoint on many of these things. But let's continue reading. According to Marx, man is primarily a belly which has to be filled and refilled constantly. The prevailing interests of man are economic in nature. He produces in order to satisfy his needs. For this purpose, he enters into social relationships with others. This is the basis of society, what Marx calls the infrastructure. Marriage, love, art, science, religion, philosophy, everything other than the needs of the belly are all superstructure determined in the last analysis by the state of the belly. No wonder Marx praised Darwin's book, The Descent of Man, another masterstroke which makes men forget their divine origin and divine purpose. Darwin said that man springs from the animal world. Man was dethroned by these two. Satan could not dethrone God, so he devalued man. Man was shown to be the progeny of animals and a mere servant to his intestines. It is a strange coincidence that the 19th century gave the world three leading personalities opposed to Christianity, all bearing the name of Charles, or Karl in German with a capital K. There was Karl Marx, which was German for Charles, Charles Darwin, and the French poet Charles Baudelaire. The latter wrote in his poem, quote, Abel and Cain, quote, race of Cain, ascend to heaven and throw God to the earth, end quote. Marx wrote to Ferdinand Lassalle on January 16, 1861, Darwin's book is very important and serves me as a basis in the natural sciences for the historical class struggle, end quote. Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue, in Socialism and the Intellectuals, says, quote, when Darwin published his Origin of Species, he took away from God his role as creator in the organic world, as Franklin has despoiled him of his thunderbolt, end quote. It was not Darwin's original intent to harm religion. He had written, there is a grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers, having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one. In order to make his position more emphatic, Darwin inserted the phrase by the Creator after breathed in the second edition. It remained there in all the succeeding editions he published. Going to pause for a moment there, folks. So apparently, he didn't include the words by the Creator in the first edition. Excuse me. But let's continue on. Later, Freud would complete the work of these two giants, reducing man basically to a sex urge, sometimes sublimated in politics, art, or religion. It was the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung who returned to the biblical doctrine that the religious impulse in man's basic urge, or is man's basic urge, the religious impulse. The age of Marx was a time of Satanist ferment in many spheres of life. The Russian poet Sologub wrote, quote, my father is the devil, end quote. Another Russian poet, Brusov, said, quote, I glorify equally the Lord and the devil, end quote. Marx was a child of the time that gave us Nietzsche, and it says in parentheses here, Hitler's and Mussolini's favorite philosopher, Max Stirner, an extreme anarchist, and Oscar Wilde, the first theoretician of freedom for homosexuality, a vice which today has met with acceptance even among the clergy. Satanic forces prepared Russia for the victory of Marxism. The time of the revolution was a period when love, goodwill, and healthy feeling were considered mean and retrograde. Girls hid their innocence and husbands their faithfulness. Destruction was praised as good taste. Neurasthenia as the sign of a fine mind. This was the theme of new writers who burst on the scene out of obscurity. Men invented vices and perversions and were fastidious in their avoidance of being thought moral. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Doesn't this sound like modern Western culture to you? Think about that. Understand what's been done here in the West. How many of the ideas and doctrines that we get from those in positions of power are very leaning towards cultural Marxism. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Cultural Marxism. How does it all relate? Well, let's continue on, and we'll see. How was it that Stalin became a revolutionist after reading Darwin? As a student in an Orthodox seminary, he obtained from Darwin the concept that we are not creatures of God, but the result of an evolution in which ruthless competition reigns. It is only the strongest and most cruel who survive. He learned that moral and religious criteria play no role in nature, and that man is as much a part of nature as a fish or an ape. Long live ruthlessness and cruelty. Darwin had written a scientific book setting forth his theory of origins. It had no economic or political implications. But though many might go so far as to concede that God created the world through a long process of evolution, the end result of Darwin's theory has been the killing of tens of millions of innocents. He therefore became the spiritual father of the greatest mass murderer in history. Beyond the intellectual turmoil of the 19th century can be traced the influence of the French Revolution, which was spiritually very much akin to the Russian cataclysm of the 20th century. During the upheaval in France, Anarchist Cloutz, a leading French revolutionary and Illuminatus, declared himself to be, quote, the personal enemy of Jesus Christ, end quote. He proclaimed before the convention of November 17, 1792, quote, the people is the sovereign and the God of the world. Only fools believe in any other God, in a supreme being, end quote. The convention then issued a decree proclaiming the nullification of all religions. For those of us who take seriously the words of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil, the meaning is clear. We implore a loving God to protect us and society around us from false doctrine, from pernicious art that accustoms us to evil under the guise of beauty, and from immorality in life. Then we need to have no fear of the devil's snares. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. If there is no devil, then you don't have to fear a devil, right? And that's precisely what cultural Marxism, secular humanism, all these philosophies try to teach us. All of these ideals, that's what they try to teach us. There is no devil. This is probably the greatest trick the devil has ever played on us, is to convince us that he does not exist. All throughout time and all throughout culture, people have acknowledged this evil force, as it were, that sometimes leads us astray, that we all fight with, that we all struggle with. There's definitely something to the concept of both good and evil, and the existence of this evil influencer force that affects us all on some level. To deny the existence thereof is to deny a major portion of what it means to be human, and a major portion of the human psyche. So in so doing, it's a type of denialism. It's a denialism of a creator, first of all. It's a denialism that there is opposition to this creation, an opposition to the natural world, when in fact there truly exists those in positions of power in this world right now that oppose the natural order of things, the natural cycles of time, as they were. The way that God, the Creator, made this place. They oppose that, and they seek to overthrow that and invert that. These are true things that happen in this world, and there are those influences in this world that seek this total inversion. And the best way to do that is to convince people that no such inversion exists. There's no absolute moral standard of right or wrong. And in order to do that, to convince people of that, they have to convince them that they're little more than animals, that there is no creator, that they just somehow magically, mysteriously evolved over the course of time into what they are now, and they're little more than an intellectual animal. And therefore they have no ethical or moral implications to their behaviors. This is what Marxism teaches. This is what Darwinian evolution teaches. might not be essentially what Darwin set out to do, but this is what it's been appropriated for. Let's put it that way. But let's continue reading here. For those of us who take seriously the words of the Lord's Prayer, deliver us from evil, the meaning is clear. We implore a loving God to protect us and society around us from false doctrine, from pernicious art that accustoms us to evil under the guise of beauty, and from the immorality in life. Then we need have no fear of the devil's snares. You have a choice. Do you want to become like the devil, cruel and vicious, or like Jesus, the God-man of holy love and peace? Moses Hess's false Zionism. The next section here that we'll get into. To complete the picture, we will consider Moses Hess, the man who converted Marx and Engels to the socialist ideal. There is a tombstone in Israel inscribed with the words Moses Hess, founder of the German Social Democrat Party. Hess expounds his beliefs in the Red Catechism for the German people, and we're going to quote that right now. Quote, "What is black? Black is the clergy. These theologians are the worst aristocrats. The clergyman teaches the princes to oppress the people in the name of God. Secondly, he teaches the people to allow themselves to be oppressed and exploited in God's name. Thirdly, and principally, he provides for himself, with God's help, a splendid life on earth, while the people are advised to wait for heaven. The red flag symbolizes the permanent revolution until the completed victory of the working classes in all civilized countries. The Red Republic, the socialist revolution, is my religion. The workers, when they have conquered one country, must help their brethren in the rest of the world." End quote. This was Hess's religion when he first issued the Catechism. In the second edition, he added a few chapters. This time, the same religion, i.e. the socialist revolution, uses Christian language in order to accredit itself with believers. Together with the propaganda of revolution, there are indeed a few nice words about Christianity as a religion of love and humanity, but its message must be made clearer. Its hell must not be on earth, and its heaven beyond. The socialist society will be the true fulfillment of Christianity. Thus Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. After Hess convinced Marx and Engels of the socialist idea, claiming from the very beginning that its purpose would be to give, quote, the last kick to medieval religion, end quote, and his friend George Young said it even more clearly, quote, Marx will surely chase God from his heaven, end quote. An interesting development took place in Hess's life. He who had founded modern socialism also founded an entirely different movement, a specific brand of Zionism. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Pay attention. Zionism is also a form of cultural Marxism, whether you realize it or not, and it's very much taken hold, especially in the Christian circles in the Western world here, especially in America. This Zionism has very much affected the minds of people in a lot of ways, which we don't realize. But let's continue on. Thus, Hess, founder of a socialism whose aim was to, quote, chase God from heaven, end quote, was also founder of a diabolic type of Zionism that was to destroy godly Zionism, the Zionism of love, understanding, and concord with surrounding nations. He who taught Marx the importance of class struggle wrote in 1862 these surprising words, quote, race struggle is primary, class struggle is secondary, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Why do you think they were trying to reignite the old racial division again in the Western world? All around the world, as it were. I thought we had largely got past that. The whole notion of systemic racism. But of course, they always have to keep stirring the pot and reignite the fires of such a thing in order to maintain social control, and that has to do with cultural Marxism, as well as this form of Zionism, as it were. Let's read on. He had lighted the fire of class war, a fire never extinguished, instead of teaching people to cooperate for the common good. The same Hess then breeds a distorted Zionism, a Zionism of race struggle. As we reject satanic Marxism, so also must every responsible Jew or Christian reject this diabolical perversion of Zionism. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. Remember, we're reading from a book here by one Mr. Richard Wurmbrand called Marx And Satan, so it does have a very Christian point of view in a lot of his rhetoric here that he gives. Nothing wrong with that. I agree with much of what he's saying, although there may be some distinctions that can be made. But at any rate, so he claims here that Christians and Jews alike should reject Zionism, and I don't disagree with that. Zionism is one of these things that's been established more as a political control structure rather than a type of, how should we say, reinforcement for certain religious ideals. Let's put it that way. So a lot of people don't understand what Zionism truly is. It's something that's been hijacked by the cultural Marxists, as it were. So let's read on here. Hess claims Jerusalem for the Jews, but without Jesus, the King of the Jews. What need has Hess of Jesus? He writes, quote, every Jew has the making of a Messiah in himself, every Jewess that of a Mater Dolorosa in herself, end quote. Then why in the world did he not make of the Jew Marx a Messiah, a God-anointed man, instead of a hater bent on chasing God from heaven? For Hess, Jesus is, quote, a Jew whom the heathen deified as their Savior, end quote. Neither Hess nor the Jews seem to need him for themselves. Hess does not wish to be saved himself, and for an individual to seek personal sanctification is Indo-German, he says. The aim of the Jews, according to him, must be a messianic state to prepare mankind for the revelation of the divine essence, which means, as he acknowledges in his Red Catechism, to wage the socialist revolution through racial and class struggle. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So, this guy, Hess, apparently, and Marx, as a result thereof, espoused some very notable ideas here that are derived from many of the old mystery schools and the secret societies. Once again, this idea that he claims it's Indo-German, this personal sanctification, the salvation of one's self. This is the same thing they teach within these various secret society groups, that you can achieve salvation yourself by working at it, by building it. They are the builders, after all, the ones that get things done. This is how they view themselves. They're the philosophers of fire. They see themselves as paving their own way, building their own form of salvation. They have no need for a savior, in their view, in their estimation. This is the same ideology being espoused here by Hess. So he's saying here the aim of the Jews must be a messianic state to prepare mankind for the revelation of the divine essence. And he defines that as meaning in his Red Catechism. That's to wage the socialist revolution through racial and class struggle. That's how he defines that. Let's read on. Moses Hess, who allotted to his idol Marx the task of putting an end to medieval religion, replacing it with the religion of socialist revolution, writes these amazing words, quote, I have always been edified by Hebrew prayers, end quote. What prayers do those who consider religion the opiate of the people say? We have seen already that the founder of scientific atheism prayed while wearing phylacteries before burning candles. Jewish prayers can be misused in a blasphemous sense, just as Christian prayers are perverted in Satanist ritual. Hess had taught Marx that socialism was inseparable from internationalism. I'm going to pause for a moment there, folks, and I'm going to repeat that sentence And this is hugely important. Hess had taught Marx that socialism was inseparable from internationalism. Marx writes in his Communist Manifesto that the proletariat has no fatherland. In his Red Catechism, Hess mocks the fatherland notion of the Germans, and he would have done the same with the fatherland notion of any other European nation. Hess criticized the Erfurt program of the German Social Democrat Party for its unconditional recognition of the national principle. But Hess is an internationalist with a difference. Jewish patriotism must remain, he writes, quote, "Whoever denies Jewish nationalism is not only an apostate, a renegade in the religious sense, but a traitor to his people and to his family. Should it prove true that the emancipation of the Jews is incompatible with Jewish nationalism, then the Jew must sacrifice emancipation. The Jew must be, above all, a Jewish patriot." End quote. Gonna pause for a moment right there, folks. So we see a lot of this is still transferred forward into our society today. We have these certain affiliations, these Zionist ideals in place all over the place. And it relates back to patriotic Jews, as it were, here, according to Hess. The idea of the nation-state of Israel, of the Jewish people, we have to hold that up and support that. And if you don't, well then, you're essentially not I guess, a good Jew, if that's the case, if you claim to be Jewish and you don't hold up your Jewish nationalism, you don't go ahead and maybe sacrifice your freedoms just in the name of that, because this is what's important, according to what Hess had said here, this patriotic nationalism of the Jewish state. And you see how they use these different tactics to divide people along racial lines, and they're going directly towards the Jewish type of lineage here. Let's put it that way, the lineage, dividing Christians and Jews in many ways. And we see how this has been perverted into a form of Zionism today, wherein the Christians of the Western cultures largely uphold everything Israel does. And Israel is a false face of the Jewish people. Let's put it that way. And this is where a lot of confusion sets in, and a lot of people kind of turn a blind eye to things because they think that it's the Christian thing to do. It's the right thing to do to support the Jewish people, God's chosen people, as it says in the Bible and as they claim to be in the Jewish texts. So they will turn a blind eye to the nefarious things done in the name of Israel and the United States largely backing Israel for the Jewish people, as it were, and they keep this division along these racial lines going on. And see, that's where there's also confusion. Judaism is Jewishness, is it race? Is it a race or is it a religion? And this is something that makes it kind of unique, in a sense, because there's no distinguishing language between the race of the Jew and the religion of the Jew. And there's blurred lines. And this is where people get confused, and they think that in order to uphold the perhaps spiritual integrity or the spiritual side of the Jew is to uphold the state that takes the name of the Jew. And this is where politics has been played largely, and this is where it becomes what we call Zionism. It's all about the state. You see, the state becomes God. And it's no different in this case. And we could see how the cultural Marxist revolution that's happened here has taken this and weaponized it in a way against the behaviors of people. Because if you oppose anything that the nation of Israel does, or any of the people that claim to be Jewish, of Jewish descent, then you're called an anti-Semite. You're a racist. And this causes division in much the same way as other racial tensions are brought up. And this is the whole goal here of cultural Marxism. Divide and conquer. Keep the people fighting amongst themselves. And you could control the narrative by understanding both sides, steering both sides of the argument. It's the old Hegelian dialectic at work. And maybe we'll get into that here. I'm not sure if the author touches on that in this portion of the book. But let's continue reading at any rate. Now the author says, I agree with Hess's patriotic ideas to the extent that what is sauce for the goose is what is sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. I am for every kind of patriotism, that of the Jews, the Arabs, the Germans, the Russians, the Americans. Patriotism is a virtue if it means the endeavor to promote economically, politically, spiritually, and religiously the welfare of one's own nation, provided that it is done in friendship and cooperation with other nations. But the Jewish patriotism of a revolutionary socialist who denies the patriotism of all other nations is highly suspect. This seems to be a diabolical plan to make all peoples hate the Jews. And I'm going to pause for a second here, folks. And that's essentially what I was just talking about. This is what the whole purpose of Zionism, as it's called, is to try to pin the blame for everything on the Jews. And don't we still have that going on today? Especially in the conspiratorial circles, they'll always blame the Jews because there's a few very famous, notorietous Jewish families involved in this great conspiracy, as it were, but it's not the entire people of the Jews involved. That's why people are wrong to point that out, and this was a development that was brought about by this cultural Marxism and by this Zionist ideology that it put out there. That was the whole purpose of introducing this type of Zionism to the world, to make people hate the Jews, right? And that is totally wrong. And we also have the opposite side of that, whereas you have those who, in direct opposition to this, will fully hold up anything that the Jews claim to do or want to do, or the Jewish nation, those representing the Jews allegedly want to do. And this is what's happened largely in Christian circles here in the United States and in other Western countries. They seem to have this definite affection towards the Jewish people, and they want to uphold what's good and right about Jewish culture. And so they support Israel, the state that claims to represent the Jews. But this is a deception, in my estimation. This is a deception. The state has nothing to do with the Jewish people, any more than the United States government has to do with the American people. They don't truly represent the people in the way they should, and the things they do without the approval of the vast majority of the people that they allege to represent. And don't we see this all over the place? This is a division of class warfare, another tenet here of the Marxist revolution, as it were. So they have us divided on all these lines, and people are more paying attention to the race notion of things rather than the class notion of things. And make no mistake about it, they're doing both. They're doing both in order to inculcate this secular humanist Marxist philosophy into the world. Let's read on now. If I were a non-Jew who saw the Jews accept Hess's plan of unilateral patriotism, I would oppose it. Fortunately, no Jews have accepted this satanic plan. In fact, it was Herzl who gave a sane turn to Zionism. In its modern form, no trace of Satanism has remained, and I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks, and I'm going to digress from the opinion of the writer of this. I certainly see the footprints of Marxism all over the Zionist movement today. Let's continue on, though. We'll give him a little nod there for, maybe having a divergence in opinion from myself here. But I always reserve the right to be totally wrong about all of that, but at any rate, I think it's demonstrable that we can see how Zionism has poisoned the well, so to say, here. And it still affects us today, and I don't think they've actually been able to reduce it down into a nothing here, as proclaimed by the author here. Let's read on. The race struggle proposed by Hess is false as the class struggle he enjoined. Hess did not abandon socialism for this specific kind of Zionism. After writing Rome and Jerusalem, he continued to be active in the world socialist movement. Hess does not state his thoughts clearly, therefore it is difficult to evaluate them. It is enough to know that according to him, quote, the Christian world views Jesus as a Jewish saint who became a pagan man, end quote. It is enough for us to read in his book, quote, we today long for a far more comprehensive salvation than that which Christianity was ever able to offer, end quote. From the Red Catechism, it follows that this more comprehensive salvation is the socialist revolution. It could be added that Hess was not only the original source of Marxism and the man who attempted to create an anti-God Zionism, but also the predecessor of the liberation theology currently endorsed in the World Council of Churches and Catholicism. One and the same man, who is almost unknown, has been the mouthpiece of three satanic movements: communism, a racist, hateful brand of Zionism, and a theology of revolution. No one can be a Christian without loving the Jews. Jesus was Jewish, as were the Virgin Mary and all the apostles. The Bible is Jewish. The Lord has said, quote, salvation is of the Jews, end quote, in John 4:22. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. Well, we see here, this once again is the author's opinion here on various of these claims. And I don't think he's totally incorrect. I mean, we should love the Jews. We should love all other peoples, all other human beings in this world. He's not wrong there. But I don't think he's completely right either, to be honest here. Let's continue on. Hess, on the other hand, exalted the Jews as though he consciously wanted to create a violent anti-Jewish reaction. Gonna pause for a moment. He's absolutely spot on there. I think that was the whole intention. He said that his religion was that of socialist revolution. The clergy of all other religions were crooks. Revolution was the only religion for which Hess had a high regard. He writes, quote, our religion, and in parentheses it says the Jewish, has as its point of departure the enthusiasm of a race which, from its appearance on the stage of history, has foreseen the final purposes of mankind, and which had a foreboding of the messianic time in which the spirit of humanity will be fulfilled, not only in this or that individual, or only partially, but in the social institutions of all mankind, end quote. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. That sounds very much like what they teach in the secret society groups, in the mystery schools, almost verbatim. This is the notion that leads to the modern incarnation of this ideology, and it's known as transhumanism. Let's continue on, though. This time, which Hess calls messianic, is the time of the victory of the socialist world revolution. The idea that the Jewish religion has had as its point of departure the concept of a godless socialist revolution is an ugly joke and an insult to the Jewish people. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks, and I don't disagree with that statement. It is an insult to the Jewish people and an ugly joke to suggest that man, walking away from God, turning their back on God and becoming gods of sorts themselves is a total disgrace. And the antithesis of what any morally upright person of the Judeo-Christian philosophies would see here. Let's read on, though. Hess speaks persistently in religious terms, but he does not believe in God. He writes that, quote, "Our God is nothing more than the human race united in love," end quote. I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. That sounds very much, once again, like the things they teach in the secret society groups and the occult mystery schools, these secret fraternities through which they claim to espouse the secrets of the ages. This is the kind of things they teach throughout all these different groups. Same kind of ideology, maybe not in the exact words, but very similar words we've heard come from their mouths. Let's read on, though. The way to arrive at such a union is the socialist revolution, in which tens of millions of specimens of his beloved mankind will be tortured and killed. He makes no secret of the fact that he wishes neither the domination of heaven nor that of earthly powers, which are both oppressive. There is no good in any religion except that of social revolution. And he says here, quote, "It is useless and inefficient to elevate the people to real freedom and to make them participate in the goods of existence without freeing them from spiritual slavery, i.e. from religion," end quote. And I'm going to repeat that quote, folks. Think on this, ponder upon this phrase that was said here by Hess, and this was very much the guy who heavily influenced Marx. You see, Marx was not really the one who came up with all of these cultural ideas and ideologies. He's just the guy that took credit for it. He's the fall guy. He happened to be in the right circles at the right times and, prolifically wrote a whole lot of letters back and forth with some others and had communication with people. I think he was a stooge, a useful idiot for people like Hess to get the ideas out there. He was their fall guy. He was their willing scapegoat without realizing it. But let's read that phrase again. This comes from Hess, Marx's compatriot here. Quote, "It is useless and inefficient to elevate the people to real freedom and to make them participate in the goods of existence without freeing them from spiritual slavery, i.e. from religion," end quote. So you could see this guy had little regard for anything that tends towards the spiritual. He thought strictly in the terms of the hyper-materialist viewpoint here in this world. Gross materialism, and that's what cultural Marxism is built upon. Let's read on. He speaks in one breath about the absolutism of celestial and earthly tyrants over slaves. The satanic depths of communism can be understood only by knowing the kind of man Moses Hess was, for he influenced Marx and Engels, with whom he founded the First International, as well as Bakunin. Without a knowledge of Hess, Marx is unintelligible, because it is he who brought Marx to socialism. Consider Marx's words already quoted, quote, "Words I teach all mixed up into a devilish muddle. Thus anyone may think just what he chooses to think," end quote. Marx wrote in such a manner. Hess's writings are an even more devilish muddle, which are difficult to untangle, but which must be analyzed for possible connections between Marx and Satanism. Hess's first book was called The Holy History of Mankind. He proclaimed it to be, quote, "a work of the Holy Spirit of truth," end quote, saying further that as the Son of God freed men from their own slavery, Hess would free them from political bondage. And he says here, quote, "I am called to witness for the light, as John has been," end quote. And I'm going to pause for a moment here, folks. And this in and of itself identifies Hess as a member of one of these occult fraternities. That statement right here, I am called to witness for the light as John has been. And of course, he's speaking about John the Baptist, who is held in high regard by the Freemasonic fraternity as well as many others and the Society of St. John. All of these things go back a long way within the secret brotherhood in the secret schools. So Hess identifies himself as being a mouthpiece of the occult fraternities. In this manner, there it is right there in that phrase. That being the case, let's continue reading. I don't want to get hung up on that point because we only have about 15 minutes left. At that time, Marx, who was still opposed to socialism and had not known Hess personally, started to write a book against him. For unknown reasons, this book was never completed. He later became Hess's disciple. As previously indicated, Hess's avowed aims were to give a last kick to medieval religion and to produce ravages. In the introduction to his book, Last Judgment, he declares his satisfaction that the German philosopher Kant had allegedly, quote, decapitated the old Father Jehovah together with the whole Holy Family, end quote. Hess covers his own ideas with the name of the great philosopher. Kant had had no such intentions. He had written to the contrary, quote, I had to limit knowledge to make place for faith, end quote. Hess declares the Jewish as well as the Christian religion to be dead, which does not prevent him from writing in Rome and Jerusalem about, quote, our holy writings, end quote, the holy language of our fathers, our cult, the divine laws, the ways of providence, and godly life. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So Hess espoused pseudo-religious ideals, in some regards, but completely disavowed God himself. Claimed that the Jewish as well as the Christian religion were a dead thing, and have we heard this? Of course we have. Nietzsche was famous for penning the phrase, God is dead, in his writing, in his book, The Gay Science. And this came about again many years later when the New York Times wrote about it. And even Elton John recorded a song that says, and the New York Times said, God is dead. And I cover this in my book, The Demic of Pan. So if you're interested in a little bit more into the backstory behind that, you could check that out. But let's continue on in the reading here. It is not that at different stages in life he held different opinions. In his pseudo-Zionist book, he declares that he does not disown his former godless endeavors. No, this is an intentional, devilish muddle. Hess was Jewish and a forerunner of Zionism, because Hess, Marx, and other people like them were Jewish. Some people consider communism a Jewish plot, yet Marx also wrote an anti-Jewish book. In this respect, too, he has simply followed Hess. Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So you see, a lot of the idea is to create this division, as it were, and to write paradoxical things, and this is, a hallmark, once again, of the secret society groups and the occult fraternities. They like to teach in paradoxes. So, too, did Hess and Marx write in paradoxes. It wasn't a Jewish conspiracy, folks. It never really was. It isn't today. Are there some powerful Jews involved? Yes. But it's not a Jewish conspiracy. So it's incorrect to say the Jews are behind it, and this is exactly the kind of thing that Marx, Hess, Engels, and these various others who espoused these ideas wanted to put forward. They wanted to create this tension on purpose and to make people think that perhaps there was something to that. But it's not the truth of the matter. There's people from all different races, religions, and cultural backgrounds involved in this great conspiracy, as it were. But let's continue reading here. The Zionist Hess, who elevates Jewry to heaven, wrote in his book titled About the Monetary System, quote, "The Jew, who had the role in the natural history of the social animal world to develop mankind into a savage animal, have fulfilled this, their professional job. The mystery of Judaism and Christianity has been revealed in the modern Judeo-Christian. The mystery of the blood of Christ, like the mystery of the old Jewish worship of the blood, appears here unveiled as being the mystery of the predatory animal," end quote. And I'm going to pause for another moment here. So this once again identifies Hess as a member in good standing of the secret occult fraternities. This very idea is taught within many of these different schools of thought, especially the Rosicrucian teachings, as they were. This idea that the Jewish root race was the modern forebears here of our cycle of mankind right now, the division between the Atlantean period and this period that we're in now. And this goes back to their cosmology once again, and it's a topic for another day, but this I just thought is interesting in pointing out. Hess identifies himself very much as a member of these occult fraternities. He identifies himself with that statement in that way, as well as the other statement made prior. So in my estimation, he was being fed a load of crap from the secret societies, as it were, as they continue to do today, these same things that they teach. And sometimes there's maybe a kernel of truth to some of what they say, but most of which is poison at this point. And he espoused this poison and used it and utilized it in a way that has affected society as a whole through the tool that is Karl Marx, and through cultural Marxism, and through also the ideas presented by Darwin to back up these claims and ideals, and to use this as a manipulation of the human psyche into believing they're little more than animals. Let's continue reading, though. It says, "Don't worry if you fail to understand these words. They were written mixed up into a devilish muddle, but the hatred for Jewishness contained in them is clear. Hess is a racist, Jewish as well as anti-Jewish, according to the needs of the spirit which inspired his works, and which he calls holy." Gonna pause for a moment here, folks. So yes, this mixed up devilish muddle that the author speaks about here, if you understand and have studied the secret brotherhoods, the secret society groups, the occult fraternities, you understand exactly what he's saying there and what he's alluding to. It's not that much of a muddled mess if you speak their language of symbology and understand what he's saying here. And this directly identifies him with these groups, in my estimation. Let's continue reading, though. "Hitler could have learned his racism from Hess. He who had taught Marx that social class is a decisive factor also wrote the contrary. Quote, 'Life is an immediate product of race,' end quote. Social institutions and conceptions, as well as religions, are typical and original creations of the race. The problem of race lies hidden behind all the problems of nationalities and freedom. All past history was concerned with the struggle of races and classes. Race struggle is primary, class struggle is secondary. How will Hess manage to have so many contradictions or contradictory ideas triumph?" Gonna pause for a moment here, folks, because these are the same ideas that are taught by the secret fraternities. Let's read on here. So it says, "How will Hess manage to have so many contradictory ideas triumph?" And he says here, quote, "I will use the sword against all citizens who resist the endeavors of the proletariat," end quote. "We will hear the same from Marx." Marx said, quote, "Violence is the midwife which takes the new society out of the womb of the old one," end quote. Marx's first teacher was the philosopher Hegel, who merely paved the way for Hess. Marx, too, had sucked poison from Hegel, for whom Christianity was wretched in comparison to the glorious past of Greek culture. Hegel wrote, quote, "Christians have piled up such a heap of reasons for comfort in misfortune that we ought to be sorry in the end that we cannot lose a father or a mother once a week." End quote. Well, for the Greek, quote, "misfortune was misfortune, pain was pain." End quote. Christianity had been satirized in Germany before Hegel, but he was the first to satirize Jesus himself. He also wrote nice things about Christianity, the same devilish muddle. We are what we feed upon. Marx fed upon satanic ideas, therefore he set forth Satanist doctrine. So I'm going to pause for a moment right there. So we see, once again here, the ideas that are presented here from Marx. They come from these various other people, Hegel, Hess. These are largely the ones who outlined exactly what cultural Marxism is, what secular humanism is. And they fed these ideas to Marx, and they taught him how to reach in dichotomies, in paradoxes. They did the same thing, and this is exactly how they work within the secret society groups, and this identifies these men as having belonged in some regard to some of these groups, because they teach the same things within these secret societies. It's all the same thing, just with different language, different words, and the author of this book calls it Satanist doctrine, which it does kind of run along the lines of what we would consider satanic. This would be anything that's antichrist in spirit, anything that's the antithesis of what's good for the individual, for man himself, for the spiritual aspects of mankind, of things here. This is the antithesis of that. This is setting up the state. It's a control system. It's the Antichrist system. That's what cultural Marxism is all about, setting this up. It's what Darwinian evolution was all about. It was changing man's mind about his place in the universe. Was the tool used in regards to this to steer the man towards the hyper-materialist viewpoint, that the physical world is all there is, these things that we could detect with our 5 physical senses here. This is all there is, and there's nothing that exists beyond that. This is what it was to convince man of, that he was an accident, flying through space at 500,000 miles an hour, spinning at 1,000 miles an hour, circling in the infinite void on a speck of dust. An accident of creation, not created by a creator, just an accident, an explosion. One day nothing exploded and became everything, and here we are now on this infinitesimally small speck of dust flying through the infinite void. And nothing really matters. That's what Marxism, that's what Darwinian evolution teaches. That's the ideology that it implants in the minds of men. And this makes man little more than an animal, having no moral or ethical compass. This is what's needed in order to put this system in place to elevate the state to godhood. And that's what they're building here in this transhumanist future, this control grid, this total panopticon control grid, outlined in Marxist ideology. But there's still hope, folks. Get close to God. We're living in interesting times. That's all we have for time for tonight, folks. Thank you for tuning in. We'll catch you next time on the Alchemical Lantern. Have a good night now.